The lieutenant who dismissed her as just a supply officer had 34 hours before he'd be bleeding out in a compound courtyard begging her to save a mission. His arrogance had turned into a massacre. Captain Lyra Thorne stood in the back corner of the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Rattlesnake, 28 years old with eyes that had seen things no PowerPoint briefing could capture. The room smelled of stale coffee, generator exhaust, and the particular tension that came from young men planning violence in a land that had been killing foreigners since Alexander the Great. She occupied her corner with the stillness of someone who'd learned that movement drew attention. 5'6", lean in the way that came from carrying heavy loads over bad terrain, with dark hair pulled into a regulation bun, and a face that gave away exactly nothing. Her hands rested loose at her sides. No fidgeting, no wasted motion. The only tell was how her thumb occasionally brushed her left wrist, where fabric-covered ink nobody in this room had clearance to ask about. Lieutenant Bryce Kellerman stood at the front of the room, pointing to satellite imagery projected on the plywood wall. 26 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from succeeding at hard things without ever failing at something that mattered. His green beret sat at a precise angle on his head, earned 6 months ago after 2 years of the hardest training the Army could devise. Infiltration at 2,200 hours. Kellerman said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd read the doctrine and believed in it. Ground insert 3 clicks from target. Foot movement through this wadi system. Expected time on objective 90 minutes. Positive identification required. Minimize civilian casualties. Thorne studied the imagery with eyes that had analyzed hundreds of compounds across 4 deployments in places that didn't appear on any official map. The target sat in a shallow valley, 3 buildings arranged in a rough U-shape around a central courtyard. Intelligence called it a Taliban logistics hub, lightly defended, minimal preparation. But the shadows told a different story if you knew how to read them. The disturbed earth near the walls could be fighting positions. The sight lines were too clean, suggesting someone had cleared fields of fire. The main building's roofline was perfect for a final defensive position, and the single obvious entry point, the one Kellerman was pointing to with such confidence, funneled attackers into a space with no covered egress. She'd seen this before. Nangarhar province 2 years ago. A compound that looked odd until her team breached into a carefully prepared kill zone. The only reason any of them survived was because she'd been on Overwatch and identified the primary firing positions before they activated. 3 insurgents dead in under 10 seconds, and her team leader had called it luck even while pulling his people back to reassess. 2 weeks later, that same team leader was dead in a similar compound, and luck had nothing to do with it. Thorne's thumb pressed against her wrist, feeling the raised ink beneath the fabric. 13 talons on a hawk's feet, 13 promises kept, 13 people who died because she'd made a decision behind a rifle scope. Questions, Kellerman asked, scanning the room with the expectation that there wouldn't be any. Thorne raised her hand slightly, not aggressive, just present. Kellerman's eyes slid past her, then reluctantly returned. Captain, that primary breach point, she said, her voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the cramped space. It creates a fatal funnel with no covered egress. If the compound is hardened beyond the intelligence estimate, your assault element will be silhouetted against their own breach light, with walls on both sides and nowhere to go, but forward or dead. The room went quiet. 12 sets of eyes turned toward her. Kellerman's jaw tightened in a way that said he was working very hard to maintain professional courtesy. Ma'am, he said the words, somehow managing to sound like both a title and a dismissal. This is tactical planning. Where's your superior? Thorne met his eyes without expression. That would be me, Lieutenant. The silence stretched. Master Sergeant Garrett Hawkins, Kellerman's team sergeant, and a man who'd been in combat long enough to recognize things that didn't add up, shifted slightly in his seat. His weathered face showed the calculation of someone reassessing assumptions. Kellerman's face colored slightly. With all due respect, ma'am, logistics officers shouldn't concern themselves with tactical operations. Intelligence shows light resistance. We've rehearsed the assault. My team knows their job. I'm sure they do, Thorne said, but intelligence can be wrong. And when your team is pinned in that breach point with no fallback position and enemy fire coming from positions you didn't account for, you're going to remember this conversation. Something flickered in Kellerman's eyes. Anger, certainly. Humiliation at being questioned in front of his team. But underneath something uglier, the wounded pride of a man who'd worked desperately hard to earn his place and now felt it threatened by a supply officer who spent her days counting bullets and MREs. "You know what your problem is, Captain." The words came out harder than professional discourse allowed. "You think reading intelligence reports makes you a warfighter? Some of us have actually been downrange." Thorne's eyes went cold for exactly 1 second. Something ancient and dangerous moved behind them, a predator assessing whether the situation required violence. Then it was gone, replaced by perfect professional neutrality. "You're right, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "I should stick to my lane. Best of luck on your mission." She turned and walked toward the door. The assembled soldiers watched her go, and the silence she left behind was heavier than words. Lieutenant Colonel Wade Blackwell stood at the back of the room, 42 years old, with the weathered competence of someone who'd commanded soldiers in actual combat. He'd said nothing during the exchange, but his expression had shifted from neutral observation to something more thoughtful. "Lieutenant Kellerman," Blackwell said, his voice cutting through the awkward quiet, "continue your brief. Captain Thorne will accompany your element as an observer. That's not a request." Kellerman's face showed the struggle between military discipline and personal resentment. Discipline won barely. "Yes, sir." Lyra Thorne had learned patience on a Wyoming ranch where winter could kill you if you didn't pay attention, and the nearest neighbor lived 9 miles away, down roads that disappeared under snow from November to March. Her father, Thomas Thorne, had been quiet in the way of men who'd done a tour in Desert Storm and come back with things they didn't talk about. He'd put a rifle in her hands when she was 7, a Ruger 10-22, small enough for her to handle, but real enough to demand respect. "Breathe," he'd said, standing behind her as she aimed at a target tacked to a hay bale 50 yards away. "Squeeze, don't pull. Follow through." The lessons that mattered came later. At 12, a coyote had been killing chickens, and her father handed her the rifle before dawn. "Wait until you're sure," he'd said, his breath fogging in the February cold. "You don't get to take the shot back." She'd waited 47 minutes in temperatures that made her fingers ache and her eyes water. The coyote finally emerged from the tree line, moving with the caution of a predator that had learned humans meant danger. She'd controlled her breathing, let her heart rate settle, found the natural respiratory pause where the body is perfectly still between breaths. One shot. The coyote dropped and didn't move. Her father had walked over, checked the animal, then looked at his daughter with something like respect. "Clean kill. Professional." He'd picked up the carcass, carried it to the truck, and never mentioned it again. That was the day Thorne understood that patience and precision were the same thing. That violence, when necessary, should be cold and controlled. That the ability to wait was often more important than the ability to act. The Army refined what Wyoming started. She'd enlisted at 18 in 2011, just as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were shifting from invasion to occupation. Infantry training at Fort Benning had been deliberate suffering designed to eliminate the weak and harden the survivors. She'd endured it with the same patience she'd learned waiting for coyotes, never complaining, never drawing attention, just consistently performing at a level that made instructors take notice. Ranger School came next. 61 days of design misery where she learned that excellence didn't earn respect, it earned suspicion. The male students watched her differently, looking for signs of weakness or preferential treatment. The instructors graded her harder, looking for justification to remove the first woman in their class. She'd graduated in the top 15%, earning her Ranger tab through demonstrated competence that no one could dispute. But the questions never stopped. Was she actually that good, or had standards been lowered? Had she earned it or been pushed through for political reasons? The real education came at 22, when a quiet officer with no name tape pulled her aside after a training exercise. "Chief Warrant Officer Track," he'd said, handing her a folder. "Different kind of work. No details, just an address in North Carolina and a date. Show up or don't, your choice." Selection for Task Force Reaper had been worse than Ranger School, not physically, but psychologically. They tested her ability to make decisions under impossible circumstances, to live with consequences, to take a life and still function the next morning, to become someone who could end another person's existence and then sit down to breakfast. 47 candidates started, 6 finished. She was one of them. The unit called itself different things depending on who was asking. Task Force Reaper, Special Operations Advisory Element. Sometimes just the activity, But the mission never changed strategic manhunting high-value targets in denied areas. Operations that conventional special operations couldn't touch because they were too sensitive, too risky, or too likely to create diplomatic incidents if they went wrong. They'd made her a warrant officer. Chief Warrant Officer 2, because warrants could operate in the gaps of military hierarchy without attracting attention. For 4 years, from 2016 to 2020, she'd been part of a 6-person team that ran precision direct action across Afghanistan, Syria, in places that didn't appear in any official record. Lieutenant Marcus Garrett had been her team leader for the last 18 months of that service. 31 years old, former Ranger Regiment, with the kind of calm competence that made bad situations manageable. Garrett had taught her that good intelligence mattered more than good shooting, that the best operators were ghosts until the moment they needed to be seen. That patience was the highest form of tactical discipline. They'd run 17 missions together. 16 were textbook. The 17th killed him. Nangarhar Province, March 2019. High-value target in a compound outside the city, a Taliban commander coordinating IED networks across 2 provinces. The intelligence was solid, multiple sources confirming his presence. The approach was planned. The rehearsals were thorough. Garrett led the assault element while Thorne held overwatch from a rooftop 280 meters out. She'd watch through her scope as the team breached her suppressed rifle tracking potential threats with mechanical precision. Clean entry, professional movement, room clearing by the numbers. Then the secondary explosion turned night into fire. Someone had rigged the target's sleeping area with enough C4 to collapse half the structure. Garrett and 2 others were buried before anyone could react. Thorne abandoned her position immediately, running through streets that should have gotten her killed, but didn't because she moved like something wild and desperate. She'd reached the compound and started digging through rubble with bare hands, while the remaining team members pulled security. The other 2 soldiers were dead, crushed instantly. Garrett was alive barely. Thorne had done everything right. Tourniquet on what remained of his left leg, the fabric twisting tight above the compound fracture. Combat gauze packed into wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, the hemostatic agent working, but not fast enough. Needle decompression when his chest filled with blood, the catheter punching through the intercostal space with practiced precision. Every step of tactical combat casualty care followed exactly as trained. Every procedure executed perfectly. He died anyway, bleeding out from injuries too catastrophic for battlefield medicine, while she held pressure on an artery that had been severed in 3 places. His last words had been, "Not your fault, Stone," which somehow made it worse. The after-action report called it a tactical victory. 1 enemy killed, mission accomplished, acceptable casualties within operational parameters. Thorne spent 2 weeks at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, being treated for smoke inhalation, shrapnel wounds, and what the psychiatrist carefully called an acute stress reaction. When they cleared her for duty, the unit offered a choice: stay and continue operations, or transition out with an honorable commission in the conventional army where nobody would ask complicated questions about the redacted portions of her service record. She'd chosen to leave. Not because she couldn't do the work, her psychological evaluation confirmed she was still operationally sound, but because she'd realized something in that German hospital room, while her hands still shook every time she closed her eyes. She was exceptionally good at killing people. Frighteningly good. And that terrified her more than anything the enemy had ever done. The transition took 8 months. The unit scrubbed her warrant officer records, created a sanitized service history showing her as a logistics specialist with deployment experience, and pushed through a direct commission to captain. The redacted portions of her file were marked training liaison and advisory duties, technically true, meaninglessly vague. By January 2022, she was Captain Lyra Thorne, logistics officer, doing honest work that didn't require her to become something she was trying not to be anymore. Then the Army, with its infinite wisdom and terrible timing, decided Task Force Lightning needed a logistics liaison for their Kunar deployment. Someone in the Pentagon pulled her file without reading the parts that weren't there and cut her orders. So here she was, back in Afghanistan, surrounded by people who thought they understood combat, about to watch them walk into a situation she'd seen before. She carried Garrett in every decision, the careful patience that made people think she was slow instead of thorough, the refusal to send soldiers into situations she hadn't thought through from every angle, The absolute conviction that no award or commendation was worth another flag-draped coffin. The hawk tattoo on her wrist was a record, not a celebration. 13 talons, 13 promises kept, 13 people who died because she'd made a decision with a rifle. She'd come to Afghanistan hoping never to add another talon to the count. The universe apparently had other plans. Lieutenant Bryce Kellerman decided that Captain Thorne was a problem approximately 30 seconds after meeting her. Not because of anything she said, she barely spoke, but because of the way she looked at his mission planning, like someone reading a menu in a language she understood, but nobody else did. He'd spent 6 months earning his Green Beret 2 years before that in the Special Forces qualification course, and he wasn't about to let some logistics officer make him feel inadequate by standing quietly in corners and offering unsolicited tactical opinions. The confrontation over ammunition loads came 2 days before the mission. Kellerman had been reviewing the equipment manifest when Thorne appeared in the doorway of the supply tent, a tablet in her hands and an expression of professional neutrality that somehow managed to convey disagreement. "Lieutenant," she said, "we need to discuss your ammunition request." Kellerman looked up from the crate he'd been inspecting. "What about it?" "You're requesting an additional 60 rounds per rifleman. That's 9 pounds per soldier on top of the calculated load. What are you cutting to compensate for the weight?" "We're not cutting anything. We need the ammunition." Thorne stepped into the tent, set her tablet on a crate, and pulled up a spreadsheet that showed calculations complex enough to make an engineer nervous. "Current load gives you 210 rounds per rifleman at 62 grains per cartridge. That's 13.2 pounds of ammunition alone. Add 7 30-round magazines at 8 ounces each, body armor at 18 pounds, Kevlar helmet at 3 pounds, water at 6 pounds, for 3 liters individual first aid kit at 2 pounds, radio and batteries at 4 pounds, night vision at 2.4 pounds, and 2 MREs at 2 pounds. That's 54.6 pounds before mission-specific equipment." She looked up from the tablet. "You're planning a 12-hour infiltration at altitudes above 8,000 feet. At that elevation, every pound costs approximately 3% efficiency. Your team will be operating at 70% capacity before they even make contact. Now you want to add 9 more pounds per soldier. That drops them to 65%. What happens when they're exhausted and need to fight their way out?" Kellerman felt his face flush. "With all due respect, ma'am, I've been downrange. I've run operations in Helmand Province. I know what my team needs." "You ran a village interdiction in Helmand," Thorne said, her voice still perfectly calm. "Low-threat environment, close air support on station, quick reaction, force 15 minutes out. This is different. No air support, no QRF. Mountainous terrain with limited helicopter access. If something goes wrong, your team will be on their own for hours." "I think I understand my operational requirements, Captain." "I'm certain you do, Lieutenant. That's why I'm approving your ammunition load exactly as originally calculated. If you'd like to submit a written exception with tactical justification, I'll forward it to Colonel Blackwell." It was bureaucratic judo perfectly executed. Kellerman couldn't justify the change without admitting his request was based on feeling rather than analysis. And going to Blackwell would make him look like he couldn't handle a supply officer. He'd stared at her for 5 seconds, then walked away without another word. Master Sergeant Hawkins had lingered after Kellerman left, his expression thoughtful. "Captain," he said carefully, "where'd you learn to calculate loads like that?" "Experience, Sergeant." "What kind of experience?" Thorne's eyes met his, and for just a moment Hawkins saw something that didn't belong in a supply officer's face. Something cold and competent and very dangerous. "The kind that keeps soldiers alive," she said. The campaign started small after that. Comments in the dining facility about how Captain Thorne seemed awfully concerned with spreadsheets for someone who'd probably never left the wire. Observations during briefings that maybe they should trust combat experience over risk-averse planning. Kellerman never challenged her directly again, but he made sure everyone knew she was overcautious, unable to understand what it meant to make hard calls under pressure. The psychology was textbook. Kellerman was 26, newly qualified, desperate to prove he deserved the Green Beret he'd worked so hard to earn. Every mission was a test. Every decision was a chance to demonstrate competence. And here was this quiet captain, barely older than him, second-guessing his judgment with a calm confidence that suggested she knew something he didn't. It made him feel small. Men like Kellerman didn't handle small very well. The breaking point came during the tactical rehearsal 3 days before the mission. The team was running through actions on the objective when Thorne observed from the sideline that their primary breach point created a fatal funnel with no covered egress if the compound was hardened beyond the intelligence estimate. Kellerman had stopped the rehearsal mid-movement. Maybe the logistics officer took a wrong turn on the way to the supply tent, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Thorne had met his eyes across the dirt lot where they'd marked the compound layout with engineer tape. "I'm here to make sure you have what you need to come back alive, Lieutenant. If you'd prefer I stay out of tactical planning, I'm happy to do that. But when your team is pinned in that breach point with no fallback, you're going to remember this conversation." The assembled soldiers had gone very quiet. Kellerman's face cycled through anger, humiliation, and something uglier. "You know what your problem is, Captain. You think reading reports makes you a war fighter. Some of us have actually been downrange." Something had flickered in Thorne's eyes, something cold and old and lethal. Then it was gone, replaced by professional neutrality. "You're right, Lieutenant. I should stick to my lane. Best of luck on your mission." She'd walked away, and the silence she left was heavier than words. Lieutenant Colonel Wade Blackwell found her an hour later in the supply office surrounded by inventory lists and maintenance schedules. He knocked on the door frame, even though the door was open. "Captain Thorne." A moment, she looked up from her computer face neutral. "Of course, sir." Blackwell stepped inside and closed the door. 42 years old with gray threading through his hair and a face weathered by 2 decades of military service. He'd commanded troops in Iraq during the surge, earned a Bronze Star and Purple Heart in combat that still visited him occasionally in dreams. "Is there a problem with Lieutenant Kellerman?" he asked. "No problem at all, sir. Just healthy professional disagreement." Blackwell studied her. The file on his desk had her service record, the sanitized version anyway. Ranger qualified, 2 deployments listed as training liaison. Some assignments with dates that didn't quite line up. Nothing that proved anything but enough to make someone curious. "You seem pretty certain that his mission plan has flaws." "Every plan has potential flaws, sir. I was simply identifying one." "Based on what experience exactly?" The question hung between them. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "Pattern recognition, sir. I've reviewed a lot of intelligence reports." From behind a desk, among other places. Blackwell leaned against the doorframe. "I made some calls this morning, called in favors with people at Joint Special Operations Command. You know what they told me?" Thorne said nothing. "They told me Captain Lyra Thorne has a service record so heavily redacted it took 3 separate authorizations just to confirm you exist. They told me that before 2022, there's a Chief Warrant Officer Thorne who served with a strategic reconnaissance element running precision direct action in denied areas. They told me CW2 Thorne has 13 confirmed high-value target eliminations over 4 deployments." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Thorne's face remained perfectly neutral, but her hand moved unconsciously to her left wrist. "They also told me," Blackwell continued, "that if I want details, I need to submit requests through channels that'll take 6 months and probably get denied. So I'm asking directly, Captain, who are you really?" The silence stretched for 10 seconds. "I'm exactly who I said I am, sir," Thorne finally said. "A logistics officer doing her job. Everything before that is classified. I'm not authorized to discuss it. But you knew last night's mission was compromised." "I recognized a pattern that concerned me, yes, sir. And you know exactly how to respond when things go wrong." "I've had training." Blackwell pushed off the doorframe. "Desert Storm, 1991. I was a young second lieutenant, cocky as hell, certain I understood warfare because I'd read the doctrine. We had a senior sergeant guy named Williams who'd been in since the Cold War. He warned me about an Iraqi position that looked abandoned, but probably wasn't. I ignored him. Told him to trust my judgment." He paused. 3 of my soldiers died when that position turned out to be very much occupied. I got a Bronze Star for the firefight that followed, but I'd trade it in a heartbeat to have those men back. Thorne's expression softened slightly. "Sir, I'm telling you this because Lieutenant Kellerman about to learn the same lesson I did, the hard way. And I can't stop it because sometimes young officers need to get their noses bloodied before they'll listen to the people trying to keep them alive. He reached for the door, then paused. You'll accompany his team as an observer tomorrow night. Not because I don't trust his planning, though I'm starting not to, but because I suspect when things go sideways, we're going to need someone who knows how to fix them. Clear. Crystal, sir. Blackwell opened the door, then looked back. And Captain, that sergeant, I ignored Williams was his name. He survived the ambush put in for transfer 2 weeks later. I ran into him 15 years later at Fort Bragg. He told me he could have kept those 3 soldiers alive if I'd just listened. Could have, but didn't because some lieutenant thought his West Point ring made him smarter than a guy with 2 decades of experience. I'll do my best to keep them alive, sir. I know you will. Blackwell's expression was grim. That's what worries me. Thorne sat alone in her containerized housing unit at 0200 hours, unable to sleep. The thin mattress did nothing for comfort, but comfort wasn't the problem. The problem was the shape of violence forming just beyond the horizon, familiar as an old scar. She'd pulled out the photograph without deciding to. Marcus Garrett's arm around her shoulders after a successful mission in Syria, both of them younger and stupider, thinking competence could protect you from bad luck. The photo was creased from being folded too many times, the edges soft with handling. Her hands were steady. That was something. For 6 months after Garrett died, she couldn't hold a coffee cup without tremors. The psychiatrist at Landstuhl had called it a normal stress response, prescribed medication she never took. Eventually, the shaking stopped, replaced by this hollow steadiness that felt less like healing and more like amputation. The problem with having been exceptional at killing was never forgetting how to see the world through that lens. Kellerman's approach wasn't just flawed, it was specifically flawed in a way she'd seen get people killed. The breach point funneled his team through a single entry with walls on both sides and no quick egress. If the compound had prepared positions, his people would be silhouetted against their own breach light, with nowhere to go but forward or dead. It was the exact mistake that had gotten Garrett killed. She set down the photo and pulled up the mission imagery on her tablet. The compound sat in a shallow valley, 3 buildings in a U-shape around a central courtyard. Intelligence called it a logistics hub, lightly guarded, minimal defensive preparation. But the shadows in the satellite photos told a different story if you knew how to read them. Disturbed earth near walls that could be fighting positions. Sightlines too clean, suggesting cleared fields of fire. The main building's roofline perfect for a final defensive position. Nangarhar Province, a compound outside the city that was supposed to be easy until her team breached into a prepared ambush. The only reason any of them survived was because she'd been on Overwatch and identified primary firing positions before they'd been activated. 3 insurgents dead in under 10 seconds. 2 weeks later, Garrett was dead in a similar compound, and luck had nothing to do with it. Her tablet showed 0230. In 19.5 hours, Kellerman would lead his team into that compound. If she was right, if the intelligence was as compromised as she suspected, they'd walk into a situation they weren't prepared for. She could try again to convince Blackwell, could make a formal objection. Go on record, force a delay, but she'd been in the Army long enough to know how that played. She'd be labeled overcautious, unable to handle pressure. Kellerman would push back harder. Blackwell would side with his Special Forces team leader over his logistics captain. The only way they'd listen was if she proved she knew what she was talking about. And the only way to prove that was to let the situation develop until her experience became undeniable. Thorne closed the tablet and lay back staring at the corrugated metal ceiling. She could see Garrett in her mind, that expression of respect and trust that said he knew she'd keep him alive. She'd failed him once. She wouldn't fail Kellerman even if he hated her for it. Her right hand moved to her left wrist, pressing against hidden ink. 13 talons, 13 promises kept. Tomorrow might require something different. Not another kill, but whatever it took to bring people home alive. For Garrett, she thought. For people who don't know they need saving. Outside generators hummed their endless drone. In 19 hours, everything would change. Thorne closed her eyes and waited for sleep that wouldn't come, counting down to the moment she'd have to become something she'd tried to leave behind. At 21:45 hours, Captain Lyra Thorne suited up in her containerized housing unit. With the ritual precision of someone who'd done this so many times, the movements had become meditation. Plate carrier first, the ceramic plates settling against her chest and back with familiar weight. Magazine pouches loaded with 630-round mags, 180 rounds of 5.56 millimeter ammunition. Individual first aid kit on her left side positioned for cross-body access if her right arm was compromised. Radio on her right shoulder already set to the team frequency. Night vision mount on her helmet, the PVS-14 monocular tested and confirmed functional. M4 carbine lasts the weapon she'd carried across 4 deployments in 17 missions. She press-checked the chamber, out of habit, confirmed the magazine was seated, set to safety. The rifle was an extension of her body as familiar as her own hands. Garrett's photo went into her left chest pocket, positioned over her heart. A private talisman, a reminder of what happened when you got it wrong. She touched her left wrist one final time, feeling the raised ink through the fabric. 13 talons. Tonight, keep them alive. The walk to the vehicle staging area drew stares. Soldiers who'd only seen her behind a desk now watched her move in full combat kit with the efficiency of someone who belonged in it. Master Sergeant Hawkins raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The rest of Kellerman's team exchanged glances. Kellerman himself looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "Captain's coming as an observer," Lieutenant Colonel Blackwell announced to the assembled team. "This is Lieutenant Kellerman's mission. She stays out of the way unless specifically requested." Clear a chorus of "Yes, sir" from the soldiers. "Crystal, sir" from Thorne. She climbed into the lead vehicle, taking a seat in back. Kellerman sat up front, radiating cold fury. Hawkins settled beside her, his weathered face thoughtful. "Ma'am," he said quietly as the convoy prepared to roll out, "you move like someone who's done this before." "Done what, Sergeant?" "Real work, not just logistics." Thorne looked at him. Hawkins had 6 deployments and the kind of eyes that had seen enough combat to recognize things that didn't add up. "A long time ago," she finally said. "Recent enough that you haven't forgotten." She said nothing. The convoy lurched forward, rolling out into the Afghan night. Lights off, night vision on, moving through a landscape of rocks and shadows under a moon that provided just enough illumination to make the world look alien. Some lessons can't be taught, Thorne thought as the fob disappeared behind them. Only learned in blood. Lieutenant Bryce Kellerman had 34 hours left before he'd understand that truth in ways he'd carry for the rest of his life. The convoy moved through darkness toward a compound where violence waited with professional patience. And Captain Lyra Thorne, who tried so hard to leave this behind, felt herself becoming what she'd once been. A quiet professional, a guardian in shadows, someone who kept promises written in ink and sealed in blood. The mission clock started counting down. The mountains of Kunar province rose against the star-scattered sky like the broken teeth of some ancient predator. The convoy moved through valleys carved by glaciers 10,000 years ago and worn smooth by wind that had been killing the unprepared since before human memory. 3 kilometers from the target, the vehicle stopped. The silence after the engine noise was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through rocks and the distant bark of a dog in some unseen village. Kellerman's team dismounted with practiced efficiency, forming security, while team leaders conducted final checks. Thorne slipped out of the vehicle last, giving the operator space to work. She checked her rifle one more time, confirmed her night vision was functioning, adjusted her plate carrier so the weight distributed properly across her shoulders. Muscle memory from hundreds of insertions. Her body knew this ritual, even if her mind had tried to forget. The patrol order was simple. Kellerman's 12-man team would move in 2 columns with 50 meters separation. Master Sergeant Hawkins led the first element with 6 soldiers. Kellerman commanded the second element with 5 men. Thorne would move with Hawkins positioned to observe without interfering. They stepped off at 22:15 hours, moving into terrain that had been ambushing foreigners for millennia. The infiltration route followed a wadi system that wound through the mountains like a scar. Ancient water had carved these channels during spring floods, creating natural corridors that provided cover from observation, but also limited movement options. Walking in a wadi meant you were committed to the route. No easy egress if things went wrong. Hawkins set a sustainable pace, not the aggressive movement of someone trying to impress, but the steady rhythm of a professional who understood that arriving exhausted was tactical suicide. The team moved in disciplined silence, spacing maintained sectors of fire assigned and covered. Thorne fell into the rhythm automatically. Her body remembered how to read terrain in darkness, how to place her feet to minimize noise, how to scan her sector without losing awareness of the larger picture. She moved like water flowing around obstacles, never fighting the ground. After 30 minutes, Hawkins raised his fist. The patrol froze instantly, every soldier dropping into whatever cover was available. Thorne went to one knee behind a boulder rifle, tracking the darkness ahead, waiting for the signal that would explain the halt. Nothing, just silence and the whisper of wind. Then she heard it. Voices, speaking Pashto, coming from higher ground to their north. Thorne's hand moved in a sharp, controlled gesture that caught Hawkins' attention. She pointed to her ear, then north, then held up 6 fingers. Taliban patrol, 6 fighters, 80 meters away, and moving roughly parallel to their position. Hawkins' eyes narrowed. He'd heard nothing, but he trusted the signal enough to pass it back down the line. 12 American soldiers became absolutely still, barely breathing while armed men moved through darkness less than 100 meters away. The voices continued for 4 minutes. Casual conversation, complaints about the cold, someone joking about a commander's incompetence. Then the voices faded, moving west, away from the patrol route. Hawkins waited another 3 minutes before signaling movement. When they started forward again, he moved closer to Thorne. "How did you hear them?" he whispered, barely audible. "Experience, Sergeant. That's the second time you've said that. Because it's true." They moved on, but Hawkins kept glancing at her, reassessing, adding things up and not liking his conclusion. At the 1-hour mark, they reached the final covered position before the objective. A small ridge that provided overwatch of the target compound 180 meters away. Kellerman brought both elements together for final preparations, while Thorne studied the target through her night vision. The compound sat in a shallow bowl, 3 buildings arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. The main building was 2 stories positioned at the base of the U. 2 smaller structures formed the arms, creating a courtyard that was both gathering space and kill zone. Everything about it was wrong. The walls were 7 feet high, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. The courtyard was swept clean, no debris or clutter that would impede movement for defenders. The main building's roof had a low wall around it, perfect for a fighting position. Most damning was the approach. The only practical entry point funneled attackers through a natural choke point with no covered egress. It was a professionally prepared defensive position, disguised to look like a simple logistics hub. Thorne had seen this exact pattern in Nangarhar province, the compound where Marcus Garrett had died. Same layout, same sightlines, same careful preparation by people who understood how Americans operated. She moved to where Kellerman was conducting his final brief, keeping her voice low and professional. "Lieutenant," a word. Kellerman's jaw tightened. "We're about to step off, Captain." "I understand, sir, but this compound is wrong. The defensive positions, the cleared sight lines, the approach route, it's a prepared kill zone designed to look soft until someone commits. The intelligence is solid, multiple sources, ISR confirmation." "Sir, I've seen this before. This exact pattern. The compound looks vulnerable, but every element is positioned for ambush. If you breach that main door, your assault element will be in a fatal funnel with prepared firing positions on 3 sides. Kellerman's face flushed even in the green glow of night vision. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but we have a mission. My team has rehearsed this. We're going in." "Then at least designate an alternate breach point. Give your people an escape route if the primary becomes untenable." "My plan accounts for contingencies." "Your plan assumes the intelligence is accurate. I'm telling you it's not." The words hung in the cold air. Several soldiers had turned to watch the exchange. Hawkins, in particular, was studying Thorne with an expression that mixed respect and suspicion. Kellerman's voice dropped to something harder. "Captain, you have made your objection clear. Noted and logged, but this is my mission, and we're executing as planned. If you can't maintain operational discipline, you can wait here while we do our jobs." Thorne met his eyes. For just a moment, she considered pulling rank, forcing the issue, using the authority she technically possessed, but rarely invoked. But Blackwell's words echoed in her mind about young officers needing to learn the hard way. "Understood, sir," she said quietly. "Good luck." Kellerman turned back to his team. "Final checks. We step off in 5 mics." The assault element prepared to move. 8 soldiers who would breach the main building while Hawkins held a security position with 4 men. Standard direct action procedure. Textbook planning. Textbook planning that was about to collide with an enemy who'd read the same textbook and prepared accordingly. Thorne stayed with Hawkins' element, taking position where she could observe without interfering. Her rifle was ready, her night vision clear, her heart rate dropping into the calm that always preceded violence. That strange clarity she'd learned to trust, the world sharpening into focus, every detail becoming significant. Kellerman's assault element moved toward the compound with professional discipline. Hand signals, controlled movement, sectors covered, everything by the book. They reached the main door. The breacher moved forward, placing the charge with practiced efficiency. 30-second fuse initiated. The team stacked on the door, ready to flow through the moment it opened. Thorne felt her heart rate slow to 60 beats per minute, breathing controlled, every sense heightened. She knew what was coming with the certainty of someone who'd lived this before. The breach charge detonated with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding hills. The assault team flowed through the opening, professional, disciplined, moving into the fatal funnel with confidence born of training and rehearsal. For 10 seconds, nothing happened, just the sound of boots on concrete and shouted clearing commands. Then the compound erupted into violence. Muzzle flashes sparked from 3 positions simultaneously. A PKM machine gun opened fire from the western building, the heavy 7.62 millimeter rounds creating a sustained roar that drowned out all other sound. An RPG streaked across the courtyard, the rocket-propelled grenade leaving a trail of flame before detonating against the main building's wall. Rifle fire from prepared positions on the roof, precisely aimed, professionally executed. The Taliban had been waiting. They'd known Americans were coming. They'd prepared this compound specifically to kill overconfident operators who thought they understood the battlefield. Kellerman's voice cut through the radio, static controlled but tight with strain. Contact heavy, contact multiple firing positions. We're pinned down. The assault element had made it through the door, but found themselves trapped in the entry corridor exactly as Thorne had predicted. Walls on both sides. No covered egress. Enemy fire coming from positions that had been carefully prepared to create overlapping fields of fire. 2 soldiers were down, immediately wounded, but alive, dragged to cover by their teammates. Hawkins immediately began directing suppressive fire from the security position. His 4 soldiers engaged targets with disciplined bursts, but the Taliban had planned well. Every firing position had overhead cover. Every angle was protected. The Americans could suppress, but not effectively eliminate the threats. Kellerman's voice again sharper now. We can't move, taking casualties, need covering fire on that PKM position. Hawkins worked the problem professionally, designated shooters, adjusted fire, called for support. But the geometry was wrong. The Taliban had positioned their machine gun in the western building where it had perfect enfilade fire across the compound entrance. From Hawkins' position, they could barely see the gun, much less effectively engage it. The assault element was trapped. Minutes from now, the Taliban would maneuver additional forces into position. The Americans would be surrounded, casualties, mounting options, disappearing. Thorne made her decision without conscious thought. The math was simple. 8 soldiers about to die because a young lieutenant's pride had prevented him from listening. She could stay here, maintain her cover as a logistics officer, watch them get killed and keep her secret intact. Or she could do what she'd been trained to do. She tapped Hawkins on the shoulder. Cover me. When? What, Captain? But she was already moving. Thorne broke from the security position in a low run, using micro-terrain and shadows to mask her movement. Every lesson from 4 years of direct action warfare activated simultaneously. Her body knew this dance. How to read ground for cover. How to move through darkness like something born to it. How to become a ghost until the moment violence was required. She covered 70 meters in 3 minutes, moving at angles that kept solid cover between her and known enemy positions. The PKM continued its sustained fire, keeping Kellerman's element pinned. Perfect. The gunner's attention was focused forward, not on his flanks. The western building had a ground floor window left open, either through oversight or arrogance. Thorne approached from the blind side, controlled her breathing, listened. 3 voices inside. Pashto. Coordinating fire. 2 men feeding ammunition to the PKM gunner. The third directing their fire, probably the team leader. Thorne pulled a flashbang from her vest. The M84 stun grenade weighed half a pound and would produce 7 million candela and 170 decibels when it detonated. In the confined space of a room, it would be absolutely devastating. She counted 3 seconds for timing, pulled the pin, and pitched it through the window with the precision of someone who'd done this in 100 training iterations and 17 real-world missions. The explosion was deafening, even from outside. Thorn flowed through the window before the echo-faded rifle up, moving on pure muscle memory. Two insurgents were on the floor, stunned by the grenade. The PKM gunner was trying to swing his weapon around, operating on instinct despite having just been flashbanged in an enclosed space. Thorn's rifle was already tracking him. The ACOG optic settled on center mass. 2 controlled shots. The standard double tap drilled into her by thousands of hours of training. Squeeze, recover, squeeze. The suppressed rifle produced 2 sharp cracks. The gunner dropped. The second insurgent was reaching for an AK-47. Thorn pivoted, adjusted her point of aim, fired twice more. Center mass, professional, no wasted movement. He fell. The third fighter, the team leader, had been positioned near the door. He was recovering faster than the others, bringing his rifle up even as his vision cleared from the flashbang. Thorn fired once. The round caught him high in the chest, precisely placed to disrupt the central nervous system. He collapsed. The entire engagement lasted 6 seconds. 3 insurgents down. PKM silent. Thorn moved through the room, confirming each fighter was no longer a threat, then keyed her radio. Hawkins Thorn, Western building secure. PKM neutralized. Advise Kellerman to use the west wall for egress. Silence on the radio for 2 heartbeats. Then Hawkins' voice tight with something between shock and understanding. Kellerman, you heard her. Move west. Use the compound wall for cover. Kellerman hesitated only a moment. Pride versus survival. Survival won. Moving, Thorn cleared the rest of the ground floor, found stairs leading to the roof. The RPG position was up there. Another fighter who'd been raining fire down on the trapped Americans. She took the stairs like smoke, each footfall placed on the edge of the tread where wood wouldn't creak. Weight distributed, silent. A technique learned in 100 training exercises and refined in operations where noise meant death. The roof fighter heard her coming anyway. Combat instinct. He tried to swing his AK around, but he was operating in darkness, and Thorn had done this when darkness was an advantage. 1 shot. Center mass. He dropped without a sound. Thorn moved to the roof's edge, scanning for additional threats. The compound courtyard was visible from here, along with the main building and the assault elements extraction road. She keyed her radio again. Thorn has overwatch. Roof position secure. Kellerman, move your element to the west wall. I'll cover. The assault team extracted under her, covering fire, dragging 2 wounded soldiers. Thorn tracked every window, every door, every potential firing position with mechanical precision. Her rifle followed her eyes. Professional overwatch, calling out threats before they became lethal. 2 enemy northeast corner 40 meters engaging. She fired controlled pairs at movement near the eastern building. The figures dropped back into cover. Window second floor main building. Shooter with AK, engaging. The target appeared in her optic. She led the movement, slightly adjusted for distance, squeezed. The figure jerked and disappeared. The assault element reached cover. Kellerman's voice on the radio, strained but functional. We're secure. 2 wounded stable. A secondary Taliban force attempted to flank the American position, moving through the compound's eastern entrance. Thorn saw them first from her elevated position. Hawkins' 3 enemy fighters, eastern gate, coming fast. Hawkins' element engaged immediately. Disciplined fire. The Taliban fighters went to ground, returning fire, trying to close distance. Thorn provided precision shooting from Overwatch. Not suppressive fire, but aimed shots. Single rounds, finding targets at ranges that required skill and cold calculation. Each pull of the trigger was a promise kept. Each round precisely placed. The firefight lasted 8 more minutes. The remaining Taliban fighters broke contact, melting into the darkness with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been fighting foreign militaries for 2 decades. When silence finally settled over the compound, 5 insurgents were confirmed dead, with unknown wounded who'd withdrawn. Kellerman's team had 2 casualties, neither life-threatening. A lopsided victory by any tactical measure. Thorn descended from the roof, moved through the compound, and rejoined Hawkins' element. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. But inside she felt the old weight settling back into place. She'd been so close to leaving this behind, so close to being something other than what she'd become in those 4 years, with Task Force Reaper. Hawkins stared at her with an expression that mixed respect, wariness, and dawning understanding. The rest of the team looked at her differently now, not as a supply officer who'd gotten lucky, as something else entirely. The medevac helicopter arrived 30 minutes later, taking the wounded soldiers. The team consolidated, secured the compound, and prepared for extraction. Kellerman stood apart from his men, staring at Thorne with an expression she couldn't read. Shock, certainly. Humiliation. But underneath, maybe the beginning of something like understanding. The ride back to Phoebe Rattlesnake was conducted in absolute silence. Thorne sat in the same seat as before, rifle across her lap, watching the Afghan night pass by through night vision that turned the world into shades of green. Master Sergeant Hawkins sat beside her, his weathered face thoughtful. After 20 minutes, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Ma'am, I've worked with a lot of operators in my career. SEALs, Delta Rangers, Special Forces. I know what real work looks like." Thorne said nothing. "That wasn't luck back there," Hawkins continued. "That was training, serious training, the kind you don't get from logistics school. Sometimes people have varied backgrounds, Sergeant. Sometimes people are more than they appear to be." She turned to look at him. "What's your point?" "My point is that you saved my lieutenant's life tonight. Saved all our lives. And I'd like to know who I'm really working with." "You're working with Captain Thorne, supply officer. That's all you need to know." Hawkins studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough, ma'am, but for what it's worth, whoever trained you did a hell of a job. They trained me to keep people alive, Sergeant. That's what I did tonight." "Yes, ma'am, you did." The convoy rolled through the gates of Phoebe Rattlesnake at 0340 hours. The compound was quiet, most soldiers asleep, unaware that a mission had just gone sideways and been salvaged by a supply officer nobody had taken seriously. Thorne climbed out of the vehicle, stretched muscles that had been tense for hours, and felt exhaustion settling in. Not physical exhaustion, her body could operate for days without sleep when necessary, but the mental weight of violence, the emotional cost of becoming what she'd tried to leave behind. Kellerman stood by his vehicle, watching as his team dismounted and began post-mission procedures. He looked older than he had 6 hours ago. Combat did that. It stripped away illusions and forced you to see yourself with brutal clarity. Thorne started to walk past him toward her containerized housing unit, but he stepped into her path. "Captain," his voice was hoarse. She stopped. "Lieutenant, I need to say something." "You don't need to say anything. Debrief is tomorrow at 0900. "No, I do." He looked at her directly, pride stripped away by necessity. "You tried to warn me multiple times. I ignored you because I was more concerned with proving myself than listening to someone with experience. That arrogance nearly got my team killed." Thorne's expression didn't change. "Your plan was sound based on available intelligence. The intelligence was compromised. That's not on you. Don't defend me. I was wrong. About the mission. About you. About everything." He paused. "Who are you really?" "I'm exactly who I said I am, a logistics officer doing her job. Logistics officers don't clear buildings solo and kill 5 enemy combatants with the efficiency of a Tier 1 operator. Some logistics officers have varied backgrounds." Kellerman almost smiled, but it died before reaching his eyes. "I owe you everything, Captain. My life, my team's lives, our mission, all of it. You don't owe me anything. Just learn from this. Be better. That's how you pay back tonight." He nodded slowly. "I will. I promise." Thorne walked away, leaving him standing in the darkness. She could feel eyes on her Hawkins and the other team members watching from a distance. Questions forming. Assumptions being revised. By tomorrow morning, every soldier on the base would know that something unusual had happened. That the quiet supply officer had done things that didn't match her job description. The secret she'd worked so hard to maintain was cracking apart. She reached her containerized housing unit, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. Her rifle leaned against the wall. Her plate carrier still held the weight of ceramic plates. She should clean her weapon inventory, her ammunition, write the after-action report that would inevitably be required. Instead, she pulled Marcus Garrett's photograph from her chest pocket. His face looked back at her, frozen in a moment of confidence before everything went wrong. She'd carried him for so long. the weight of his death pressing on every decision, the absolute conviction that she couldn't let it happen again. Tonight she'd prevented it, saved 8 soldiers from the same kind of ambush that had killed Garrett, used the same skills that had failed to keep him alive to keep others breathing. But she'd also become what she'd tried to leave behind, the operator who moved through darkness dealing precision violence. The person who could kill 5 men in under a minute and feel nothing but professional satisfaction at mission accomplishment. She touched her left wrist, feeling the hawk tattoo through the fabric. 13 talons. 13 promises kept by taking lives. Tonight she'd kept a different kind of promise. Saved lives instead of taking them. Maybe that was progress. Maybe that was the point. Or maybe violence was violence regardless of the justification. Maybe once you became good at it, there was no real escape. Outside the base was coming awake. Early risers heading to breakfast, night shift workers returning from their posts, the normal rhythm of a forward operating base continuing regardless of what happened in darkness. Thorne lay back on her bed, still in full gear, and closed her eyes. Sleep wouldn't come, it never did after combat. But she could rest, could let her body recover while her mind processed what had happened. In 5 hours, she'd face Lieutenant Colonel Blackwell's questions. In 6 hours, the inevitable after-action review where her actions would be examined and explanations demanded. In 7 hours, the moment when her carefully maintained cover as a simple logistics officer would be stripped away completely. But for now, in this quiet hour before dawn, she allowed herself to simply exist. Neither operator nor supply officer. Neither killer nor guardian. Just a woman who'd done what was necessary and would live with the consequences. The hawk tattoo pressed against her wrist, 13 talons, recording promises kept in violence. She wondered how many more talons she could add by keeping people alive instead. Whether redemption could be measured in saved lives rather than taken ones. Marcus Garrett's photograph rested on her chest, his expression frozen in confidence that had proven misplaced. She'd failed him once. Tonight she'd succeeded in keeping his mistake from being repeated. That had to count for something. Outside, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn approaching over mountains that had watched empires rise and fall. The same sun that would illuminate the compound where 5 men had died and 80 had been saved. Thorne closed her eyes and waited for the reckoning she knew was coming. For the moment when Lieutenant Colonel Blackwell would demand answers she wasn't authorized to give. For the conversation that would end her comfortable anonymity and force her back into the world she'd tried to leave behind. Some lessons she thought can only be learned in blood. Kellerman had learned his tonight. But the deeper lesson, the one about who she really was and what she could never stop being, that one was hers alone to carry. The base alarm sounded reveille at 0600. Time to face the consequences of competence that couldn't be hidden anymore. Time to become, once again, what she'd always been beneath the careful disguise. A quiet professional, a guardian in shadows. Someone who kept promises written in ink and sealed in blood. The mission was complete. The real work was about to begin. The after-action review began at 0900 hours in Lieutenant Colonel Wade Blackwell's office. The room was small, functional, decorated only with unit insignia and a map of Cunard province marked with operational areas. A single fan fought against the morning heat that was already building despite the early hour. Kellerman stood at attention, his face pale. Master Sergeant Hawkins stood beside him, expression carefully neutral. Thorne stood slightly apart, hands behind her back, face showing nothing at all. Blackwell sat behind his desk, a classified folder closed in front of him. He'd been on the phone for 2 hours that morning, making calls to people at Joint Special Operations Command, calling in favors accumulated over 20 years of service. The expression on his face said he'd learned things that had fundamentally changed his understanding of his logistics officer. "At ease," Blackwell said. The 3 soldiers relaxed slightly, though tension remained thick in the air. Blackwell opened the folder, scanned the contents, then looked up at Thorne with eyes that had seen combat and recognized it in others. "Someone want to explain how a supply captain eliminated 5 enemy combatants in solo close-quarters battle during a Special Forces direct action mission?" Silence. Kellerman stared at the floor. Hawkins watched Thorne with open curiosity. Thorne remained perfectly still, waiting. "No volunteers." Blackwell's voice carried an edge. "Fine, I'll explain." He picked up a page from the folder, read from it in a tone that made each word land like a physical blow. Captain Lyra Thorne. Service records so heavily redacted it required 3 separate authorization codes just to confirm basic biographical data. Before your commission in January 2022, there exists a Chief Warrant Officer, Lyra Thorne, who served with Task Force Reaper, a strategic reconnaissance element conducting precision direct action operations in denied areas from 2016 to 2019. Kellerman's head snapped up, eyes wide. Hawkins' expression shifted to something like vindication. Blackwell continued, his voice harder. 13 confirmed high-value target eliminations over 4 operational deployments. Multiple decorations I don't have clearance to know the details of. Specialized training in close quarters, battle precision, marksmanship, direct action, raids, and operational planning. Served under some of the most classified operational authorities in the Department of Defense. He set the paper down, looked directly at Thorne. After a mission went catastrophically wrong in March 2019, CW2 Thorne requested transition out of Special Operations. The request was granted. Records were sanitized. She received a direct commission to captain and reassignment to conventional logistics. All of which brings us to last night when my supposedly inexperienced supply officer conducted a solo assault that would make most Delta operators proud. The room was absolutely silent. Even the fans seemed to have stopped making noise. Blackwell turned to Kellerman. "Lieutenant, you have something to say." Kellerman's face had gone from pale to red. "Sir, I didn't know. I had no idea she was—" "You didn't ask." Blackwell cut him off, voice hard as steel. "You made assumptions based on her current assignment without wondering why a Ranger-qualified officer with multiple combat deployments was working logistics. You dismissed her tactical concerns because you thought you knew better. Your arrogance nearly got your entire team killed." "Yes, sir. Last night your team walked into a prepared ambush that Captain Thorne specifically warned you about. Multiple times. You ignored those warnings because a woman with more combat experience than you'll ever have didn't fit your mental image of what an operator looks like." Kellerman said nothing. What could he say? Blackwell's voice dropped slightly. "How many of your soldiers would be dead right now if Captain Thorne hadn't been there?" "All of them, sir," Kellerman said quietly. "All of us. And yet you questioned her competence, dismissed her experience, made her job harder because your ego couldn't handle taking advice from someone you'd categorized as support personnel." "Sir, Kellerman struggled for words. "There's no excuse. I was wrong. About everything." Blackwell studied him for a long moment, then looked at Thorne. "Captain, you have been quiet. Anything to add?" Thorne's voice was calm, professional. "Lieutenant Kellerman's tactical plan was sound based on available intelligence, sir. The intelligence was compromised. That's not his fault. Under fire, he maintained discipline and extracted his team effectively. Those are the actions of a good officer." "Don't defend him," Blackwell said. "I'm not defending him, sir. I'm providing accurate assessment. He made mistakes born of inexperience and assumptions. Those are correctable. What matters is whether he learns." Blackwell leaned back in his chair, studying both officers. "CW2 Thorne, and yes, I'm using your real rank. You left Special Operations for a reason. I won't force you back into a role you chose to leave. But I need to know, can you work with Lieutenant Kellerman, help him become the officer his soldiers deserve?" Thorne looked at Kellerman, seeing past the humiliation to something underneath. A young officer who just learned the hardest lesson of military service, that pride kills and humility keeps people alive. She thought about Marcus Garrett, about the lessons he'd taught her before dying in a compound, not unlike the one from last night. About the responsibility of passing knowledge to the next generation. "Yes, sir," she said. "I can do that." Blackwell nodded. "Master Sergeant Hawkins, you're now Captain Thorne's direct liaison for all tactical planning. Every mission goes through her for operational review before my approval. If she identifies a problem, we delay until it's resolved." "Clear." "Crystal, sir," Hawkins said, unable to hide a slight smile. "Lieutenant Kellerman, you're on administrative duties pending completion of remedial training with Captain Thorne. You'll participate in mission planning, but won't lead operations until I'm confident you've internalized these lessons." Kellerman's face showed the impact of those words. Being pulled from operational command was a devastating blow to a Special Forces officer. But he stood straight and accepted odd. Yes, sir, understood. Blackwell's expression softened slightly. Lieutenant, last night you made mistakes that should have gotten people killed. The only reason they didn't is because someone with more experience bailed you out. That's not failure, that's education. The question is what you do with it. I'll learn, sir. I promise. See that you do. Blackwell stood, indicating the meeting was over. Dismissed. Captain Thorne, a moment. Kellerman and Hawkins filed out, leaving Thorne alone with Blackwell. The colonel moved to the small window that looked out over the base hands behind his back. I won't ask for details about your time with Task Force Reaper, he said. I don't have clearance, and you're not authorized to discuss it. But I need to know something. Sir, why'd you really leave? The official record says mission complications and request for transfer. What's the real reason? Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Outside soldiers went about their daily routines, unaware of the conversation happening in this small office. I lost my team leader, she finally said. Lieutenant Marcus Garrett, March 2019. Nangarhar Province, compound breach, secondary IED, catastrophic casualties. You tried to save him. I did everything right, sir. Every step of tactical combat casualty care executed perfectly. He died anyway. Too much damage. No amount of training could fix what the explosion did. Blackwell turned to face her. That's not why you left. Thorne met his eyes. No, sir, I left because I realized I was too good at killing people. Exceptionally good. And that terrified me more than anything the enemy ever did. The honesty of the statement hung in the air between them. I came here thinking I could just be a supply officer, Thorne continued, do honest work that doesn't require me to be what I was. But last night proved I can't escape it. The skills are still there, the instincts, the ability to move through darkness, dealing violence with professional efficiency. And that scares you. Yes, sir, it does. Blackwell nodded slowly. Desert Storm, Night 91. I was a second lieutenant, 22 years old, certain I understood warfare. Had a staff sergeant named Williams who tried to warn me about an Iraqi position. I ignored him. 3 soldiers died in the ambush that followed. He paused. I got a Bronze Star for the firefight after. But every time I look at that medal, I see their faces. The difference between you and me, Captain, is that I learned my lesson too late to save them. You learned yours in time to save Kellerman's team. Garrett would still be alive if I'd learned it earlier. Maybe, maybe not. Combat is chaos. Sometimes good people die despite perfect execution. Blackwell returned to his desk. What you did last night wasn't just killing, Captain. It was saving. Your skills kept 8 soldiers breathing. That's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be careful with, sir. Agreed, which is why I'm offering you a choice. He pulled out another folder. Fort Benning, Ranger Training Brigade. They need experienced operators to train the next generation. People who understand that elite doesn't mean arrogant, it means responsible. Thorne looked at the folder but didn't take it. That's a long way from counting bullets, sir. You were never just counting bullets. We both know that. Blackwell's expression was serious. You can stay here, keep pretending to be something you're not, and maybe keep a few more young lieutenants from getting themselves killed. Or you can teach hundreds of future Rangers how to do it right from the beginning. Your choice. I'll consider it, sir. Do that. Blackwell stood. And Captain, thank you for last night, for being willing to become what you tried to leave behind in order to keep my soldiers alive. It's what Garrett would have done, sir. Then he trained you well. The next 5 weeks were a crucible of a different kind. Kellerman approached training with the intensity of someone who'd seen his own mortality and didn't like what it showed him. Every morning at 0600, he met Thorne at a corner of the base they'd claimed for tactical instruction. No audience, no spectators, just a young officer trying to learn lessons his pride had prevented him from hearing before. The first week was breaking down assumptions. Show me your planning process, Thorne said on day 1 satellite imagery of a hypothetical compound spread between them. Kellerman walked through his approach. Entry points, assault timing support by fire positions. It was textbook, it was professional, it was also predictable. Now show me what you missed, Thorne said. What do you mean? You plan for the compound as it appears in intelligence. Plan for the compound as it actually is. She pointed to details in the imagery, shadows that could be prepared positions, sight lines that were suspiciously clear, approaches that funneled attackers into natural kill zones. The enemy gets a vote, she said. They've been fighting foreign militaries for 40 years. They know how we operate. They prepare accordingly. Your job is to think 3 steps ahead. Kellerman studied the imagery with new eyes, seeing patterns he'd missed before. This looks like the compound from last week. Exactly, it's a common defensive pattern. Once you learn to recognize it, you see it everywhere. How many times have you seen it? Thorne's expression didn't change. Enough to recognize it in my sleep. The second week focused on intelligence analysis. Intelligence is always incomplete, Thorne explained, walking Kellerman through case studies from her deployments, sanitized versions that didn't include classified details, but conveyed the lessons. Multiple sources don't mean accurate. They mean multiple people believe the same thing, which might be what the enemy wants you to believe. She taught him to look for inconsistencies, to question assumptions, to build contingency plans that accounted for intelligence being wrong. Trust your analysts, but verify with your own eyes, she said, and always, always have a way out if everything goes wrong. Kellerman absorbed it all with the focus of someone who'd learned that arrogance was expensive and humility was survival. The third week was practical application. Thorne took Kellerman and Hawkins into the mountains surrounding the base for realistic training. They rehearsed approaches to compounds, identifying defensive positions, planning multiple breach points, establishing covered egress routes. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, Thorne said, a phrase Garrett had drilled into her. Speed gets you killed if it's not controlled. Professional violence is patient violence. She taught them how to read terrain at night, how to move through darkness with minimal noise, how to identify ambush sites before walking into them. Skills learned through years of operations in places where mistakes meant death. Hawkins watched these sessions with open fascination. After one particularly intense rehearsal, he approached Thorne while Kellerman was conducting final checks with his team. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead, Sergeant. How many missions did you run, real ones, not training? Thorne considered the question. Classified. More than 10, yes. More than 50, no. Hawkins nodded slowly. Somewhere between 10 and 50 missions at the level you operate at. That's a lifetime of experience compressed into a few years. It felt longer than it was. I bet, he paused. You're good at this, ma'am. Teaching, I mean. You make complicated things make sense. Garrett was good at teaching. I'm just passing on what he taught me. You're the team leader you lost. Yes, he'd be proud of what you're doing. Thorne looked at him, surprised by the observation. Thank you, Sergeant. That means something. The fourth and fifth weeks were synthesis, taking everything Kellerman had learned and applying it to real mission planning. Blackwell began including Thorne in tactical reviews, her input now official rather than tolerated. The change in Kellerman was visible. He asked questions instead of asserting answers. He listened to NCOs like Hawkins, who had experience he lacked. He built contingency plans that accounted for intelligence being wrong. Most importantly, he'd learned that admitting uncertainty was strength, not weakness. Sir, I don't think we have enough information to execute this mission safely, Kellerman said during one planning session 3 weeks into his remedial training. Blackwell raised an eyebrow. Elaborate. The intelligence shows this as a soft target, but the defensive positioning suggests preparation we're not accounting for. I'd like to delay 24 hours for additional ISR before we commit forces. Blackwell looked at Thorne. Captain, I concur with Lieutenant Kellerman's assessment, sir. The risk profile doesn't match the intelligence confidence level. Delay approved. Good call, Lieutenant. After the meeting, Kellerman approached Thorne in the corridor. 3 weeks ago, I would have ignored that concern and pushed forward. I know, Thorne said, because I needed to prove I was tough, decisive, willing to take risks. And now I understand that keeping soldiers alive is more important than proving anything. He paused. You saved more than our lives that night, Captain. You saved my career, possibly my soul. That's dramatic, Lieutenant. Maybe, but it's true. His expression was serious. I'll never be able to repay what you did. For us. For me. But I'm going to spend the rest of my career passing these lessons forward, making sure other young lieutenants don't make my mistakes. That's exactly how you repay it. The new mission came 6 weeks after the compound raid. Taliban mid-level commander logistics coordination for IED networks across the province. Solid intelligence from multiple sources, but this time cross-verified with additional ISR and human intelligence. Kellerman planned the operation with Thorne and Hawkins over 3 days, building a scheme of maneuver that accounted for every lesson learned. Primary breach point, secondary breach point covered egress routes, support by fire positions, quick reaction force on standby, medevac pre-coordinated. "Sir, we're ready," Kellerman told Blackwell during the final brief. "Captain Thorne," Blackwell asked. Thorne reviewed the plan one final time, looking for flaws. Finding none. "It's solid, sir. Contingencies are appropriate. Risk is acceptable. I recommend approval." "Approved. Execute tonight at 2300. The mission was textbook. Kellerman's team infiltrated to the target compound without incident, his movement discipline impeccable. The approach used terrain features Thorne had taught him to identify, staying off predictable routes, maintaining security at all times. The breach was professional. Kellerman had designated both primary and secondary entry points, with teams positioned to exploit whichever proved more viable. When the primary showed clear, they executed with controlled precision. Light resistance exactly as intelligence predicted. 4 high-value targets captured without firing a shot. Sensitive materials recovered. 0 friendly casualties. The operation that should have validated Kellerman's growth hit an unexpected complication during extraction. A Taliban quick reaction force, roughly 15 fighters, attempted to interdict the American withdrawal. Thorne monitored from the Tactical Operations Center, listening to radio traffic, ready to coordinate support if needed. She heard Kellerman's voice calm despite the situation. "Contact eastern approach, approximately 15 enemy. Hawkins established base of fire. Second squad bound to that ridgeline. I'm calling for air support." No panic, no freezing, just professional leadership applying doctrine while adapting to circumstances. An Apache gunship arrived within 8 minutes, engaging the Taliban force with devastating effect. Kellerman coordinated the air support while simultaneously managing his ground elements movement, keeping his soldiers safe while maintaining tactical advantage. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. The Taliban withdrew with heavy casualties. Kellerman's team extracted without a scratch. Back at FOB Rattlesnake, the team's return was celebration tempered by professionalism. Good mission. 0 casualties. Objectives achieved. The kind of operation that made careers and justified deployments. Kellerman found Thorne in the TOC reviewing the after-action footage. "We did it," he said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "Everything worked, exactly as planned. Because you planned well and executed professionally, that's what good leadership looks like. I learned from the best." He paused. "Actually, I learned from someone who learned from the best, which is maybe even better because you've had time to figure out how to teach it." Thorne smiled slightly. "Garrett would have liked you, Lieutenant, once you got past your ego. I'd like to think I'm past it now." "Mostly past it," Thorne corrected. "You're still young. Some ego is acceptable. Just keep it leashed." Kellerman laughed, the sound genuine. "Yes, ma'am. Ego leashed. Lessons learned. Soldiers kept alive. That's the job. That's exactly the job." The deployment wound down over the next 3 months. Task Force Lightning compiled an exceptional operational record: 14 successful missions, 0 killed in action, minimal wounded. The kind of statistics that got noticed at higher headquarters and reflected well on everyone involved. Kellerman was restored to full operational command after demonstrating consistent professional growth. His team trusted him in ways they hadn't before, and he'd earned that trust through humility and competence rather than arrogance and rank. Hawkins became something like a friend to Thorne, their mutual respect built on shared understanding of what real work looked like. He'd figured out most of her background through observation and had enough operational experience to understand why she'd left it behind. "Ma'am, whatever you do next," he told her during one of their final planning sessions, "make sure it involves teaching. You're too good at it to waste." "I'm considering options, Sergeant." "Consider that one seriously. A lot of young soldiers need what you have to offer." On the final day before redeployment, Blackwell called Thorne to his office. The same room where he'd confronted her about her past, but the atmosphere was different now. Collegial rather than interrogatory. "Fort Benning," he said without preamble. "Ranger Training Brigade. I submitted your name formally. They want you." Thorne looked at the orders on his desk but didn't reach for them. "That's a significant commitment, sir." "It's exactly what you're suited for." Blackwell's expression was serious. "You saved Lieutenant Kellerman, helped him become the officer his soldiers deserve. Now imagine doing that for hundreds of young Rangers before they deploy, before they make mistakes that get people killed." "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach Rangers, sir." "Captain, you're one of the most qualified people in the Army to teach Rangers. You've done the work at the highest level. You've seen what happens when training fails and what happens when it succeeds. You understand that excellence isn't about being tough, it's about being smart." Thorne was quiet for a moment, thinking about Garrett, about Kellerman, about all the young officers who would deploy to combat zones with confidence born of training but not tempered by experience. "Garrett used to say that the best operators were teachers," she said. "That passing knowledge forward was more important than any single mission." "Sounds like a wise man." He was. She looked at the orders. "Fort Benning, Training Brigade, teaching Rangers how to not get themselves killed, and how to keep their soldiers alive, which is the same thing." Thorne picked up the orders, scanned them, felt the weight of the decision. She could stay in logistics, continue the comfortable lie, remain hidden. Or she could step back into the world she'd tried to leave, but this time as guardian rather than operator, teacher rather than killer. "I'll do it," she said. "For Garrett, for Kellerman, for everyone who needs someone to show them how." "Outstanding." Blackwell stood, extended his hand. "Thank you, Captain, for everything. You saved more than one mission this deployment. You saved careers, lives, maybe souls if Lieutenant Kellerman's assessment is accurate." Thorne shook his hand. "Just doing what Garrett taught me, sir. Passing it forward." The farewell with Kellerman happened on the flight line minutes before Thorne's transport departed for Germany and then on to the States. He approached in full uniform professional bearing, but his expression was open in a way it hadn't been when they'd first met. "Captain Thorne, permission to speak freely." "Granted. You didn't just save my life that night. You gave me a career, a purpose, an understanding of what leadership actually means." He paused. "I'll never forget it. And I'll spend the rest of my time in uniform making sure other lieutenants learn these lessons without needing someone to bail them out of ambushes." "That's exactly what you should do." Thorne's expression softened. "You're going to be an outstanding officer, Lieutenant. You have the capability. You just needed to learn humility. That's a lesson many people never learn. I learned it from you. You learned it from experience. I just provided the classroom." Kellerman pulled something from his pocket, a unit coin from his ODA, the kind given to people who'd earned respect through shared hardship. "This is from the team. We wanted you to have it." Thorne took the coin, feeling the weight of it. On one side, the team's insignia. On the other, an inscription, "Quiet professionals keep others alive." "Thank you," she said and meant it. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." She boarded the C-130, found a seat among pallets of equipment and other soldiers heading home. The aircraft lifted off from FOB, Rattlesnake, banking away from mountains that had killed so many foreigners over so many centuries. Thorne looked out the small window, watching Afghanistan disappear below. A country she'd returned to hoping never to use her skills again. Instead, she'd been forced to become what she'd tried to leave behind. But this time felt different. This time she'd use those skills to save rather than take, to teach rather than execute, to pass forward the knowledge Garrett had given her before dying in her arms. She pulled out his photograph, now creased and worn from being carried through another deployment. His face looked back at her, frozen in confidence. "I'm going to teach them," she said quietly, words lost in the aircraft noise. "Going to make sure the next generation knows what you taught me, that patience matters more than speed, that humility keeps people alive, that quiet professionals don't seek glory, we keep others alive to earn it." On the photograph didn't answer, but she felt something like peace settling over her. Not the absence of pain Garrett's death would always hurt, but the presence of purpose, a way forward that honored his memory by preventing his fate from being repeated. She touched her left wrist, feeling the hawk tattoo through the fabric. 13 talents, 13 lives taken in service of missions she couldn't discuss. She'd spent 2 years trying to forget them, trying to be something other than what she'd been. Now she understood. The skills weren't the problem. The killing wasn't who she was. What mattered was why and how those skills were used. She'd killed 13 people as an operator. How many could she save as a teacher? How many young rangers could she guide toward competence and away from arrogance? How many Kellermans could she catch before they needed to learn in Blood Fort Benning? Ranger Training Brigade, teaching the next generation of America's elite infantry. It felt right in a way logistics never had. 3 months later, Captain Lyra Thorne walked through the gates of the Ranger Training Brigade at Fort Benning, Georgia. The morning was humid, typical for summer in the South, and the air thrummed with the sound of soldiers training. She wore instructor tabs on her uniform, now the Ranger tab she'd earned years ago, joined by new insignia that marked her as someone trusted to shape the next generation. Her assignment was to the Tactics Committee, teaching advanced small unit tactics to Ranger students who thought they understood warfare. Her first class was Aero 800 hours. 40 Ranger students, all male, all confident, all certain. They knew what combat looked like because they'd survived training that eliminated most candidates. Thorne stood at the front of the classroom, let them settle, let them make their assessments. She knew what they saw. A female captain, late 20s, probably some staff officer, assigned to teaching duty. Someone who'd read the manual but never done the work. "I'm Captain Thorne," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "For the next 4 weeks, I'm going to teach you how not to get yourselves and your soldiers killed when you deploy to combat zones where the enemy has been fighting foreign militaries since before you were born." One student, a lieutenant who looked maybe 24, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's your operational background?" She smiled slightly. "Classified." "But you've deployed multiple times, i.e. combat deployments." "Yes." The students exchanged glances, still uncertain, still making assumptions. "Let me tell you about a lieutenant I worked with," Thorne said. "Smart guy, excellent training, Green Beret. He had everything figured out, knew exactly how to run missions because he'd read the doctrine and survived the qualification course." She pulled up satellite imagery on the screen behind her. A compound in Kannar Province, the one where Kellerman had almost died. He walked his team into this compound based on solid intelligence from multiple sources, textbook planning, professional rehearsals, everything by the book. She paused, let them study the image. "Anyone see the problem?" Silence. The students looked at the compound, seeing nothing wrong. "Let me help you," Thorne said, and began pointing out the defensive preparations. The fighting positions disguised as disturbed earth, the cleared fields of fire, the approach that funneled attackers into a kill zone. This lieutenant missed all of this, walked his team into a prepared ambush. 5 Taliban fighters in defensive positions, PKM machine gun, RPG, professional execution. She pulled up the next slide. After-action photos showing the compound from inside the firing positions evident in daylight. The lieutenant's team was pinned down, 2 wounded, ammunition running low, no good escape route. About 10 minutes from complete tactical failure. The students were leaning forward now, invested in the story. "You know what saved them?" Thorne asked. "Air support," one student guessed. "Quick reaction force," another offered. "No," Thorne said quietly. "What saved them was someone who'd seen this pattern before. Someone who understood that intelligence can be wrong and plans can fail. Someone who'd learned these lessons the hard way and was positioned to do something about it." She paused, let the silence build. "That lieutenant is still serving. Excellent officer now, leads missions with careful planning and appropriate humility. His soldiers trust him because he earned that trust by learning from his mistakes." One student raised her hand, a female specialist, one of the first women in the Ranger course. "Ma'am, were you the person who saved them?" Thorne met her eyes. "That's not the point of the story. The point is that every one of you will deploy. Every one of you will face situations where the plan fails and the intelligence is wrong. What matters is whether you've learned to recognize danger, adapt to circumstances, and keep your soldiers alive." She pulled up the next slide, course syllabus. "For the next 4 weeks, I'm going to teach you pattern recognition, threat assessment, intelligence analysis, tactical planning that accounts for everything going wrong, and most importantly, the humility to know what you don't know. She looked at the assembled students, seeing Kellerman in every face. Young officers and NCOs confident in their training, not yet tempered by experience. Some of you will ignore these lessons, she said. You'll deploy thinking you know better. You will make decisions based on ego rather than analysis. And maybe you'll get lucky. Maybe you'll survive your mistakes. Her expression hardened slightly. But maybe you won't. Maybe you'll walk into an ambush that kills your soldiers because you were too proud to listen to warnings. Maybe you'll learn these lessons in blood instead of in a classroom. The room was absolutely silent now. My job, Thorne said, is to make sure you learn them here, where mistakes are correctable and failure doesn't come with flag-draped coffins. She moved to the window, looked out at Rangers training in the Georgia humidity, and thought about Garrett, about Kellerman, about all the soldiers who'd benefit from lessons passed forward. There's a hawk tattoo on my wrist, she said, not looking at the students. 13 talons. Each one represents a promise kept. For years, those promises were about taking lives in service of missions I can't discuss. She turned back to face them. Now I'm making different promises. To teach you what I learned. To keep you alive. To make sure the next generation of Rangers understands that excellence isn't about being tough, it's about being smart. A student raised his hand. Ma'am, what happened to the team leader who taught you? Thorne was quiet for a moment, Garrett's face vivid in her memory. He died doing what he'd trained his whole career to do. He kept his soldiers alive through professional competence and appropriate caution. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes combat is chaos, and good people die despite perfect execution. She paused. But he taught me that the best operators are teachers. That passing knowledge forward is more important than any single mission. That our job isn't glory, it's keeping people alive long enough to earn it. The students looked at her with new understanding. Not just an instructor, someone who'd done the work, someone who carried weight they couldn't see but could sense. Let's get started, Thorne said, pulling up the first tactical problem. We have 4 weeks to make you competent enough that when you deploy, you'll recognize danger before it kills you. She taught that day like Garrett had taught her, with patience, with precision, with the absolute conviction that these lessons mattered more than anything else she could do. After class, the female Ranger candidate approached her desk. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did you really serve in special operations? Thorne studied the young soldier, seeing determination mixed with uncertainty. The challenge of being first, of proving yourself in spaces where people questioned whether you belonged. Yes, she said simply. Was it hard, being a woman in that world? Everything worth doing is hard. The question is whether you let difficulty stop you or define you. The candidate nodded slowly. I won't let it stop me, ma'am. I know you won't. You made it this far. That's the hard part. Now you just have to prove you belong here every single day. Like you did, Thorne smiled. I'm still proving it. Every class I teach, every student I train. That's the job. Proving yourself through competence, not rhetoric. The candidate saluted and left. Thorne watched her go, seeing herself 8 years ago, young and determined, trying to earn respect in a world that questioned her right to be there. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to a contact she'd saved months ago. Lieutenant Bryce Kellerman, now commanding his ODA with distinction, still deployed but safe. She typed a message, started teaching today. Your lessons learned are now being passed to the next generation. Garrett would be proud. The response came 30 minutes later. He'd be proud of you, ma'am. We all are. Keep them safe. Thorne set the phone down, looked at Garrett's photograph positioned on her desk next to Kellerman's unit coin. 2 reminders, one of failure that taught her what mattered, one of success that proved she could pass it forward. Her left wrist tingled where the hawk tattoo pressed against fabric. 13 talons, marking 13 lives taken. She wondered how many talons she'd need to mark lives saved. Hundreds of Rangers trained over years of teaching. Thousands of soldiers kept alive because their leaders learned from her lessons. It was a debt that could never be fully repaid. But it was work worth doing. Outside, Rangers trained in the Georgia heat, preparing for deployments to places where mistakes meant death. Inside, Captain Lyra Thorne began planning the next day's class, teaching pattern recognition and threat assessment to soldiers who didn't yet understand how much they needed these lessons. Some people led from the front, visible and decorated. Others guarded from the shadows, keeping people alive through knowledge passed forward. She knew which one she was, and she'd made peace with it. The quiet professional, the guardian in shadows. The teacher who kept promises written in ink and sealed in blood. For Garrett, for Kellerman, for every soldier who would deploy into danger with lessons learned in classrooms instead of cemeteries. This was her mission now, and she would execute it with the same precision she'd once applied to hunting high-value targets. One student at a time, one lesson at a time, one life saved at a time. The work continued.